Okay, so we're going to be doing this this week. And then I'm not sure exactly how we're going to get all this squared away, but of course, hopefully I will have updated you by the time I post this. But I'm going to go ahead and go through the lecture that, of course, we missed. We started out with the beginning of the Cold War. So we talked about the Nuremberg war crimes trials, formation of the UN, the Marshall Plan, those sorts of things there. And what we're going to go ahead and talk about now is the Berlin Blockade. So at the end of the war, Germany, of course, is split into four zones. The Soviets had come in, of course, from the east, whereas the British, the French, and the Americans had come in from the west. So, of course, they split Germany kind of almost right down the middle. The eastern zone belonged to the Soviets, and then the Americans, the British, and French have their own zones in the west. Well, Berlin is an unusual case because the city of Berlin was in East Germany. And it was decided because Berlin was the capital of Germany that the four powers would actually divide up Berlin as well. So Berlin, in the middle of East Germany, the Soviet zone, itself was divided into four zones, a Soviet, British, French, and American sector there. Now, so you kind of have the western part of the city of Berlin, which was controlled by the British, the French, and the Americans, is kind of like this little island of democracy and capitalism and freedom in this sea of Soviet communism that existed in East Berlin and around in East Germany. So you got this little tiny pocket of kind of the West in the heart of this communist East Germany here. Now, in early 1947, the British and the American zones in West Germany essentially united. They called themselves Bizonia, and eventually the French joined it as well, but they continued just as an administrative term. They just call it Bizonia. It's not really official. But there's they begin to do their own currency. They had an occupation currency that all four powers were using. But in the West, they start using a different currency because the Soviets were kind of manipulating the currencies. So in order, and that's not terribly germane to what we're discussing. I'm just kind of giving you some background there. But what you do need to know is the Soviets aren't happy with what's going on in the West. And so in June of 1948, the Soviets essentially close West Berlin, that little island in East Germany. They close that off from the West. Now, according to the treaties at the end of the war, the Western powers were able to have road and rail lines connecting West Germany to West Berlin, so they could go through the Soviet zone. But suddenly the Soviets closed that down here in 1948. They say, no, you can't. And they claim, they essentially claim that it's not safe. They say, you know, the roads and the railroads are in disrepair, and we can't guarantee your safety, so that's why we're closing it. And of course, it was just complete crap. They just were trying to essentially, by closing off West Berlin to West Germany, their hope was to make the people of West Berlin economically dependent upon the Soviets, and so that the Soviets could essentially just absorb West Berlin into the Soviet zone here. But this is, as I say, in complete violation of the agreements that were made. There were 2 million people living in West Berlin at the time, and of course they need supplies. They need coal, they need food, they need various consumer goods, and they had those imported from West Germany, and now they can't do it. Now theoretically, this isn't going to happen. Well, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, he refuses to let the Soviets get away with this. And what he does is he actually says, well, let's take those supplies then in the air. And we have the beginning of the Berlin Airlift. And this is the Berlin Blockade, by the Soviets blockading Berlin off. Now we have the Berlin Airlift. And I want to be very clear about something here, and this is something that a lot of undergraduates kind of make mistakes with. This is not the Berlin Wall. Okay, if I ask a question about the Berlin Blockade and you write about the Berlin Wall, you're not going to do well, okay? So remember, this is the Berlin Blockade. This is not the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall is not going to happen until 1963. This is 1948, 1949 we're talking about. So Harry Truman authorizes an airlift, meaning we're going to be flying planes from West Germany into West Berlin carrying goods. Now, at the height of the airlift, you see about 175 planes a day flying into West Berlin, and they're flying almost tail to nose as to get in there. In fact, many of the pilots that actually did this had been combat pilots in World War II, had flown bombers in World War II, and they said the most intense flying they ever did was the flying in the Berlin airlift here, because you had to be very careful because you're flying in these really close formations. And it didn't help that the Soviets were kind of buzzing these guys, trying to get them to screw up and make mistakes, and there were a few instances of collision. So this was dangerous. This was called Operation Vittles. Operation Vittles by the United States. This airlift bring in about 2.5 million tons of food, food, fuel, supplies, all these things into West Berlin during the airlift. Now, one of the pilots was a fellow by the name of Gale Halverson, or Hal Halverson as he was called. And Halverson was a pilot from Logan, Utah, I believe, who one day lands in Berlin, and I think, if I recall the story correctly, his plane needed some maintenance or something, and he's walking around and he sees some kids, and they, of course, want chocolate because they know Americans have chocolate. He didn't have anything to give them, and he felt bad. So he decided from that point on, when he flew into West Berlin, he was going to drop candy. He was going to tie little parachutes to candy and gum and whatnot and drop it out the window. And he does this, and it kind of captures a lot of people's imagination. And his superior officers get a hold of this. They think this is a great PR thing to do. So they designate this Operation Little Vittles, and pretty quickly, many other bomber pilots were actually dropping candy as well. And Halverson became known as the Candy Bomber, and this becomes Operation Little Vittles, dropping all this candy. All told, you have about 23 tons of candy and about 250,000 parachutes. I think with the president of the National Confectioners Board in the United States, something along those lines, he actually volunteered a lot of candy for this operation. I know there was a college student, I want to say in Massachusetts or Virginia, and she and her friends began to volunteer to tie the candy to parachutes so the pilots wouldn't have to waste their own time tying the parachutes together. And this sounds like a really kind of cute story, but there's a bigger aspect here. Now, first of all, the Soviets realize the Soviets were very cynical about the possibility of an airlift, because in World War II, in 1942-43, you had the German Sixth Army besieged at Stalingrad. We talked briefly about Stalingrad the other day. And the Germans had attempted an airlift. They attempted to keep that army supplied by air, and they weren't able to do it. Of course, the Soviets could shoot down the German planes, and there was very unfavorable conditions. And critically, the Germans simply did not have the aircraft infrastructure to wage that kind of an airlift. By contrast, the Americans did. We had, just a tremendous amount of aircraft. So did, the British had quite a few as well. And the Soviets couldn't shoot at our aircraft. We weren't in a state of war. But as I say, they did try to buzz our planes. So there was that. Well, in 1949, May of 49, the Soviets realize our plan isn't working, and we're looking like fools to keep it going. So kind of quietly, they just go ahead and they open up the roads and the railroads again. And, of course, there was no repair just done to them, right? They were unsafe apparently a year earlier, but, they were safe then. Now, as I say, this story, particularly about Gil Halvorson and the candy bomber, this sounds very cute and fun little story to tell your kids. But the reality is, there's a deeper reality here, and there's an important kind of shift in paradigm that occurs during the Berlin blockade. And this shift occurs when the Americans go from seeing the Germans as the Nazis and the thugs and the perpetrators of Auschwitz and anti-Semitism and what have you. There's a psychological shift where Americans go from seeing Germans in that light now to seeing them as another oppressed people who are being threatened, their freedoms are being threatened, and we need to help. And that's an important kind of psychological switch that happens here for Americans. So the Germans become, like I say, in the American mind, this oppressed people that need our help. Not long before, we were dropping high explosives on them. Now we're dropping candy, right? And just as importantly, just as critically, we start to see the Soviets go from being our friends and allies who fought and bled for us in the struggle against Nazi Germany to now being almost as bad, if not as bad. We see them as being the new oppressors. We see them as being the new threat to the world order. And certainly many people had before this point, but now it's like really, for most of the American people, oh, the Soviets aren't acting in good faith. They are trying to cause problems. So the Berlin blockade represents this kind of important psychological shift. And I mean, some people would suggest this is the first great crisis of the Cold War, so the Cold War begins here. I would say it probably begins earlier, even in World War II. But certainly, this is, I think, when the Cold War, the reality of the Cold War kind of hits home for most Americans. All right, so that's what I want to talk to you about the Berlin airlift, but let's move right along here. And let's talk a little bit about kind of the United States expanding its infrastructure to wage the Cold War here. Now, in 1946, we have this American diplomat by the name of George F. Kennan. And he, very bright guy, he had been the charge d'affaires of the American embassy in Germany during World War II, and he'd been interned for a while before he'd been repatriated after the war broke out, after the United States entered the war. Interesting guy. He just died, I think, in like 2003 or 2004. It was like 102 or something like that. But he's an interesting guy. And he, in 1946, so George Kennan kind of warned American officials that the Soviets really have no long-term plans for cooperation with the West. He sends something called the Long Telegram. And the Long Telegram, among other things, it kind of states that Soviet communism is just kind of a veneer for kind of good old-fashioned Russian expansionism and imperialism. The Russians had always tried to expand their borders, and they'd always had this imperialist streak. And now they've got this revolutionary rhetoric and this kind of Soviet veneer that they have, but fundamentally what they're doing hasn't changed that much from the time of the czars. So he advocates a policy that comes to be known as containment. And it says, containment says Soviet economics aren't rooted in reality. The Soviet Union it's vastly overextended itself economically, and since it can't really sustain itself, since communism is not ultimately a self-sustaining system, a war with the Soviet Union is not necessary. It's going to fall apart on its own. It'll fall apart under its own weight. Now, his thing is, we don't need to actively wage a war against the communists. We just need to contain it. We just need to keep them from spreading. We need to fight communism, through other means if necessary. But we need to keep communism within its borders, within Russia's borders. And when he wrote this, he was probably thinking the Soviet Union probably only had about another 10, 15 years of life left to it. I don't think he appreciated that it was going to be another, nearly 50 years. But very soon, this policy of containment is accepted by the Truman administration, and they begin to implement it there. Now, during World War II, we also had an agency that was formed called the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. Now, the OSS was essentially an intelligence gathering gathering agency, and it's also a kind of a saboteur agency. And you had OSS agents that were active in Europe and in Asia throughout from about 1942-43 through the end of the war. And this really was kind of America's first foray into the world of a kind of a professional intelligence organization. Prior to that, you simply had military intelligence agencies, naval intelligence, army intelligence, and now you kind of have the first kind of federal government civilian intelligence agency. Well, when the war ends, Truman disbands the OSS because he was afraid that it could very easily become an American Gestapo. He was scared that it could become an agency of repression. But he realizes the benefits. He realizes you need a coordinated way to gather intelligence on the nation's enemies. And he authorizes this. And what he actually creates, together with a few admirals, was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. He had wanted what he called a daily newspaper, meaning an intelligence newspaper. And that's what they got. So the CIA was there to essentially provide him with a kind of a daily, this is what's going on in the world. But because he's still afraid that the CIA could potentially become an agency of repression, he has it written into the charter that they cannot operate on domestic territory, meaning they cannot spy on Americans here in the United States. We've got the NSA now, so. But that was his idea, right? That the CIA would not be allowed to function within the United States. Now, in line with the containment policy, during the Berlin Blockade, the United States also creates a formal alliance system with Western Europe. And this is called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, I had mentioned this before in the context of when we were talking about isolationism and how, George Washington probably would have been okay with something like the Wartime Alliance in World War II, having allies to meet the emergency. I mean, we had allies during the American Revolution, certainly. But he probably would have opposed something like this, right? This is an ongoing treaty. We still have it today, NATO. And NATO was designed to provide collective security for Western Europe and the United States. You had the Soviets had promised they were going to have free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. They don't. They have a communist coup takes place in Czechoslovakia. And there's just, as I say, this sense from the West that the Soviets cannot be trusted. They're not fair dealers, right? Just like Hitler was before World War II. So hopefully we'd learned a lesson here. But the principle, kind of the guiding principle of NATO is an attack on one is an attack on all. Meaning, if the Soviet Union were to attack, say, Italy, a member nation, or eventually West Germany, which became a member nation eventually, that it would be considered an attack on all the states, an attack on the United States. So if the Soviets move west, they wouldn't just be attacking Italy or West Germany, they would be attacking the United States, and that would lead to another world war, and hopefully it was a way to deter Soviet aggression there. Now, the Western European states, who, of course, their economies were smashed from World War II, it kind of gives them some economic breathing room. That is to say, they don't have to focus as much on defense. They can focus more on consumer goods and rebuilding their infrastructure because they don't have to spend as much on defense, which is the largest portion of pretty much any nation's budget, right? But what that means, too, is they're also kind of farming out their defense. And you can argue about the morality or the politics of that. But that's what they were doing. They were essentially saying, the United States has got our back. Okay, we're okay. We don't need to worry about it because you attack us, you're going to deal with the United States. Now, the Soviets themselves will eventually create kind of a mirror image alliance. This will be created in 1955, called the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact is not really an alliance of free states. It's essentially the Soviets telling their people what they're going to do. The Soviets have, of course, much more direct control over their alliance than the United States did. Not to say that the United States didn't have a lot of control over NATO. Absolutely they did. But what I'm saying is the Soviets pretty much were calling the tune because those member states were afraid, 68 in Czechoslovakia, if you stray too far from what the Soviets thought you should be doing, the Soviets would send in tanks and essentially invade your country. Now, at the same time, 1949, again, as the Berlin Blockade's going on, we have the nation-state of West Germany is created out of Bisonia. This is formally created in May of 1949, so you have West Germany. Then in October, to kind of counter that, in October of 1949, the Soviets create the state of East Germany. So now we have the two Germanys, right? We have West Germany and East Germany. Now remember, that little tiny pocket of West Berlin in the Soviet zone is part of West Germany. When Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, when they met at Yalta in 1945 and they agreed to divide up Germany, they were just talking about zones of occupation to kind of get rid of the Nazis, to kind of impose some order. And the theory was it's only going to last maybe 2 years, and then we'll pull out, right? The West will pull out, the Soviets will pull out. They had no idea they were going to be dividing Germany for over 40 years, for about 45 years. They had no idea they were going to do that. But the problem was, once both sides were there in Germany, they were entrenched, and neither side wanted to pull out because they were scared that the other would take over their portion of Germany there. Now, in 1947, Truman is going to sign the National Security Act. Truman will sign the National Security Act. This is, again, 1947, so this is before the Berlin Blockade and all that. In 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act. And this coordinates all the branches of the military under the Department of Defense. Now, prior to this, you had the Department of War, you had had the Department of the Navy, and they had been separate. You had the Secretary of War, Secretary of the Navy. Now, we have the Department of Defense, so we have the Secretary of Defense, and then you have kind of beneath him the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy. So it kind of streamlines government. And one of the reasons why they do this is because we're creating an independent Air Force at this time too. The Air Force had been part of the Army through much World War II, and we're creating a fully independent branch of the military, the Air Force, which is charged with kind of strategic bombing. And instead of just creating a Department of the Air Force, they decided, at a cabinet level, they decided let's just create a Department of Defense, and then the various secretaries of the Army, Navy, Air Force, they can now answer to the Secretary of Defense. And we also have the creation of the National Security Council, the National Security Council. And this was kind of a group of advisors, civilian and military, that could advise the president and help him act quickly. Because, of course, events in, with modern communications and transportation, events move much more faster in the 1940s than they had in the 1860s, right, when Lincoln faced his crisis. So the idea is you've got to have a president who can move quickly, and this is what it does. In early 1950, you also have the National Security Council presents a paper to Truman. And this is a report generally about America's readiness for military, about its commitments around the world, and kind of what challenges lay ahead in confronting the Soviet Union. Now, this paper was called NSC, National Security Council, NSC 68. And NSC 68 this paper calls for a vast expansion of the United States military. Between 1950 and 1953, defense spending in the United States goes from about 5% of GDP to about 14.2% of GDP. So from 5% to 14.2% between 1950 and 1953. Now, the United States is at peace, right? We're not actively fighting any wars. Well, I mean, 1950 we were fighting the Korean War, pardon me. But generally speaking, that's, you know, a much smaller war than, say, World War II. But as we'll see, even after the Korean War, when we will be at peace, the United States will organize itself and its defense infrastructure and industry as though we were at war. So we're even when we're at peace, we're kind of building up our military as though we are at war. We see spending increased from about 13 billion during the same period, 1950 to 1953, from about 13 billion to about 50 billion, from 13 billion to 50 billion per year. And of course, the United States even builds a bigger bomb, the thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. And the attitude is, look, we'll work with other countries where we can, but we'll, you know, if we have to go it alone, we're going to be prepared to go it alone. Now, let me, of course, again put this into context. The history of the United States up until this time has always been this: very small standing armies, very small standing armies. And then a war happens, and then boom, we blow up, we build a massive military, fight the war, win the war, and then we downscale the military. Another war, we build it up again, we fight, we win, and then we downscale it. And this happens again and again and again throughout the history of the United States. And now what we're seeing here in the post-World War II era is we're not going down. I mean, we do a little bit after the war, but then we get right back up again. And we've had a massive, massive military and defense industry ever since.